Before the gunfire echoed through courtyards and alleyways, before bodies were found sprawled beneath stairwells and palm shadows, Baldwin Village already carried the weight of inevitability. Locals didn't call it Baldwin Village. They called it the Jungles, a name born from thick tropical landscaping, and a maze of post-war apartment buildings packed so tightly together they felt like concrete vines choking the streets. From above, the neighborhood looked ordinary. On the ground, it felt sealed off from the rest of Los Angeles, a place where sight lines disappeared, sound traveled unpredictably, and danger could emerge from any corner without warning. The Jungles sat in South Los Angeles like a pressure cooker, surrounded by major roads, yet somehow isolated from them. Designed in the 1940s and 1950s as affordable housing for working families, the complex became increasingly dense over time. Walkways curved inward, courtyards overlapped, and apartment blocks formed narrow corridors that funneled movement into predictable choke points. What architects once considered communal space later became tactical ground. For gangs, it was ideal. For residents, it was a trap. By the early 1990s, the Jungles had become one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in South Los Angeles, not because of wealth, but because of control. Control of who moved through the neighborhood, control of who sold narcotics, control of who lived or died without witnesses. Police response times were slow, patrol visibility was limited, and the layout allowed shooters to disappear in seconds. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an urban battlefield waiting for armies. For decades, the Black Pea Stones had established themselves as the dominant power inside the Jungles. Emerging in the early 1970s, the Jungles set of the Black Pea Stones embedded itself deeply into the social and economic fabric of the area. Generations grew up under their shadow. They controlled corners, stairwells, and drug pipelines that ran quietly but efficiently. Their authority wasn't always loud, but it was understood. Respect was enforced. Defiance was answered. Homicide was not an abstract concept here. It was a currency. The Stones' long-standing presence created a sense of territorial ownership that extended beyond turf lines. The Jungles weren't just where they operated. They were who they were. Outsiders were noticed immediately. Movement that didn't belong was questioned. And when those unwritten rules were violated, consequences followed swiftly and brutally. At the same time, Los Angeles itself was changing. The early 1990s saw shifting demographics, economic pressure, and an explosion in the street-level narcotics trade. Gangs no longer survived on reputation alone. Profit mattered. Expansion mattered. And few gangs embodied that expansionist mentality more aggressively than 18th Street. Predominantly Latino and rapidly growing, 18th Street was not content with holding ground, it sought to absorb it. Territory by territory, block by block, they pushed southward from areas north of Baldwin Village, probing for weaknesses, testing boundaries, and challenging established powers. Unlike older gangs rooted to single neighborhoods, 18th Street operated more like a network. Multiple cliques spread across the city, reinforcing one another, sharing resources, and backing expansion with sheer numbers. This made them particularly threatening to entrenched gangs like the Black Pea Stones. What one clique couldn't hold, another could reinforce. What one member lost, another replaced. It was growth through pressure, and by the early 1990s, that pressure was being felt at the edges of the Jungles. Residents sensed it before the first major bloodshed erupted. Tension lingered in the air. Strangers appeared where they hadn't before. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar faces walked by. Small confrontations, looks, words Gestures began stacking up like dry brush waiting for a spark. The jungles were no longer insulated. They were being encroached upon. Law enforcement, stretched thin across South Los Angeles, largely failed to grasp what was forming. To police, Baldwin Village was already violent, already troubled. But they didn't yet see the collision coming. Two organized forces competing not just for pride, but for a lucrative narcotics economy hidden within concrete corridors and shadowed courtyards. When violence did erupt, it would not be random, it would be systematic, and it would be devastating. By 1994, the stage was fully set. A long-established black gang defending its home. A rapidly expanding Latino gang pressing inward. A neighborhood designed to conceal shooters and bury evidence. All it needed was a single confrontation, a single insult, a single act of violence to ignite what would become one of the most intense periods of interracial gang warfare South Los Angeles had ever seen. And that spark was already burning. By the time the first shots were fired in earnest, the jungles were no longer just a neighborhood under strain. They were a contested prize. Two very different gang cultures were now moving on a collision course, each driven by its own history, structure, and vision of power. What made the coming conflict so volatile was not only race, but purpose. Both sides believed they had a right to the same ground, and neither was willing to retreat. The Black Pea Stones had ruled the jungles for decades. Their presence dated back to the early 1970s, when South Los Angeles was undergoing massive social change. Factories closed, poverty deepened, and gangs evolved from the loose neighborhood groups into organized street institutions. The Jungle's set became one of the Stone's most entrenched factions, benefiting from the area's layout and relative isolation. Over time, they established a disciplined hierarchy, enforced boundaries, and developed a narcotics trade that quietly sustained the set. This wasn't chaotic street dealing. It was structured, territorial, and defended with violence when necessary. For the Stones, control of the jungles was non-negotiable. The apartment complexes weren't just turf. They were lineage. Older members mentored younger ones. Reputation carried weight. Slights were remembered. Homicide wasn't committed recklessly, but when it occurred, it was calculated, designed to send a message that echoed through the courtyards. Outsiders learned quickly that the jungles were not neutral ground. Enter 18th Street, a gang with a completely different DNA. While the Stones were deeply rooted, 18th Street was expansive. Born near the Pico Union area, the gang exploded across Los Angeles through relentless recruitment and aggressive territorial growth. By the early 1990s, they had become one of the largest gangs in the city, with cliques operating semi-independently, but united by name, numbers, and retaliation. Their power didn't come from a single neighborhood. It came from scale. As Latino populations grew and economic opportunities shrank, 18th Street pushed outward. Their model was simple: identify profitable territory, test resistance, and apply pressure until control shifted. This often meant moving into areas traditionally dominated by black gangs, especially where drug markets were already established. The jungles, with its dense population and concealed selling points, stood out as a prime target. One clique in particular, the Rancho Park clique, began appearing deeper and deeper inside Baldwin Village. At first, their presence was subtle, a few unfamiliar faces, then extended hangouts, then open loitering on streets like Gibraltar Avenue, a clear signal to anyone watching that boundaries were being challenged. To the Black Pea Stones, this wasn't just disrespect, it was an invasion. What made the situation more explosive was that neither gang operated in isolation from the larger racial dynamics of South Los Angeles. The early 1990s were already marked by tension, economic strain, post-Rodney King unrest, and distrust between communities. When a predominantly Latino gang began asserting itself inside a historically black stronghold, the conflict took on a racial dimension that magnified every confrontation. A stare became a threat. A word became a provocation. A fistfight became a potential homicide. Both sides interpreted events through their own logic. The Stones saw 18th Street's presence as a deliberate attempt to strip them of power and profit. Allowing it to continue would signal weakness, inviting further encroachment. For 18th Street, resistance was expected and surmountable. They had faced it before in other neighborhoods. Violence was simply part of the expansion process, a cost of doing business. As narcotics sales intensified across South Los Angeles, the stakes rose higher. Control of the jungles meant control of cash flow, influence, and reputation. Losing it meant fragmentation and vulnerability. Each side understood this implicitly. That understanding hardened positions and narrowed options. There was no room left for negotiation. Residents began to notice the shift. Patrol cars cruised through more frequently. Helicopters hovered overhead. Whispers of impending violence circulated in hallways and parking lots. Parents warned children to stay inside. Longtime tenants recognized the signs. This wasn't a temporary flare-up. It was the beginning of a war. By 1994, the jungles had become a chessboard with pieces already in motion. The Black Pea Stones were defending a legacy. 18th Street was advancing an empire. Every encounter carried the weight of what might come next. And when the first true act of bloodshed occurred, when one side suffered a loss that could not go unanswered, the conflict would shift from tension to slaughter, from rivalry to open warfare. The line had been crossed. The only question left was how far the violence would go. In gang warfare, wars rarely begin with grand declarations. They begin with moments, brief, volatile encounters, where ego, territory, and fear collide. In the jungles, that moment came in 1994, and once it happened, there was no turning back. What had simmered for months erupted into bloodshed that would transform Baldwin Village into a combat zone. It started on Gibraltar Avenue, a narrow artery running through the heart of the jungles. Members of the 18th Street gang, specifically from the Rancho Park clique, were posted up inside territory long controlled by the Black Pea Stones. They weren't passing through. They weren't hiding. They were openly hanging out, asserting presence in a way that could not be ignored. To the Stones, this was a direct challenge, a public declaration that their authority was being tested. Words were exchanged. Accounts differ on what was said, but the meaning was clear. Respect had been violated. Lines had been crossed. In gang culture, especially in a place like the jungles, allowing such a challenge to go unanswered was unthinkable. What began as an argument quickly escalated, fueled by years of resentment, racial tension, and the ever-present pressure of territory and profit. The confrontation ended, not with fists, but with gunfire. Soon after, an 18th Street member was slaughtered. The homicide sent shockwaves through both gangs. For 18th Street, it was a declaration of war. For the Black Pea Stones, it was a message sent, but one that demanded preparedness for what would come next. In gang logic, blood never stands alone. It demands response. Retaliation came swiftly. Another shooting, then another. Each act of violence justified the next, creating a self-sustaining cycle that fed on anger and fear. The jungles, once tense but controlled, descended into chaos. Gunfire echoed through courtyards at all hours. Stairwells became ambush points. Parking lots turned into execution grounds. Each side hunted the other, often with little regard for who might be caught in between. What made this phase particularly brutal was the intimacy of the battlefield. The jungles were dense, confined, and crowded with civilians. Shooters knew where their rivals lived, where they parked, where they gathered. Escape routes were memorized. Hiding spots were pre-selected. Violence was not random, it was targeted, deliberate, and relentless. As bodies fell, fear spread among residents. Families slept on floors to avoid stray rounds. Children learned to distinguish fireworks from gunshots. The sound of helicopters became a nightly constant, circling above like mechanical vultures. For those living there, the war wasn't an abstraction. It was a daily reality measured in sirens and funerals. The racial dimension of the conflict hardened quickly. Each homicide reinforced stereotypes, deepened mistrust, and widened the divide between Black and Latino residents. What had begun as a territorial dispute over drug control now carried the weight of collective identity. Every act of violence was interpreted not just as gang retaliation, but as racial aggression. This perception intensified the brutality, removing any remaining restraint. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace. Officers responded to shootings but rarely arrived in time to catch suspects. Witnesses were afraid to talk. Evidence vanished into the maze of buildings. The jungles protected its own silence, even as blood soaked into the pavement. To police, the area became a black hole of information, a place where homicide scenes multiplied faster than arrests. By the end of 1994, the conflict had fully ignited. There was no longer any illusion of containment. Both gangs mobilized members, armed themselves heavily, and prepared for sustained warfare. The initial spark on Gibraltar Avenue had grown into an inferno, and the jungles were burning from the inside out. This was no longer about one death. It was about dominance, about survival, and about who would be left standing when the smoke finally cleared. By 1995, Baldwin Village was no longer simply dangerous. It was under siege. The conflict between the 18th Street Gang and the Black Pea Stones had evolved into full-scale urban warfare, with the jungles serving as both battlefield and graveyard. What began as targeted retaliation now unfolded as a sustained campaign of violence, measured not in days or weeks, but in bodies and bullet casings. Shootings became routine. Daylight offered no protection. Nightfall offered no peace. Gunfire cracked through courtyards in the early morning hours and echoed off concrete walls long after sunset. Residents learned to read the rhythm of violence, to know when to drop to the floor, when to run, and when to freeze. In this environment, survival depended on instinct and luck in equal measure. The design of the jungles amplified the bloodshed. Narrow walkways funneled foot traffic into predictable paths. Multi-story buildings provided elevated firing positions. Dense foliage concealed shooters before and after ambushes. A single gunman could strike and vanish in seconds, swallowed by stairwells and hallways. For both gangs, the terrain became a weapon. The retaliation cycle intensified. An 18th Street member would be slain, prompting a counterstrike within hours or days. A Black Pea Stones member would be gunned down in response, triggering another wave of violence. Each homicide raised the stakes, pulling in more participants and hardening attitudes on both sides. Mercy became a liability. Hesitation became dangerous. Civilians bore the brunt of the chaos. Mothers shielded children with their bodies. Elderly residents avoided windows entirely. Many families who could afford to leave did so, abandoning apartments that soon became staging grounds for gunmen. Those who stayed lived with constant dread, unsure if the next burst of gunfire would punch through their walls. Innocents were wounded. Some were slaughtered, without ever being the intended target. The jungles earned a grim reputation across Los Angeles. Word spread quickly. This was a no-go zone, a place where even seasoned criminals moved cautiously. Taxi drivers refused fares. Delivery services declined routes. Police entered in groups, aware that uniforms made them visible targets. The neighborhood's name became shorthand for unchecked violence. Racial tensions deepened as the body count climbed. Each side framed the conflict as existential, portraying the other as invaders or oppressors. Rumors circulated, often exaggerated, sometimes false, but always inflammatory. Every shooting was discussed, dissected, and mythologized, ensuring that anger never cooled. In this atmosphere, reconciliation was impossible. Only dominance mattered. Despite increased patrols, law enforcement remained largely reactive. Officers responded to scenes after the fact, after the shooter had fled, after the victim had bled out. Arrests were rare. Witnesses stayed silent, bound by fear and distrust. The jungles had become a closed system, governed by its own rules, where official authority barely penetrated. As 1995 gave way to 1996, the violence showed no signs of slowing. Instead, it began to spread outward. Surrounding neighborhoods felt the ripple effects as ambushes occurred beyond the jungle's borders. The war was no longer contained. It was metastasizing, threatening to engulf a larger swath of South Los Angeles. For the gangs, this was a test of endurance. For residents, it was a nightmare with no end in sight. And for the jungles, the war had rewritten its identity forever, from housing complex to battleground, from community to cautionary tale written in blood. The question was no longer whether the violence would stop. It was how much more the neighborhood would have to endure before anything, changed. As the war ground on, it began to change shape. What had started as a two-sided conflict inside a confined neighborhood expanded outward, pulling in new players and widening the circle of bloodshed. By 1996, the violence in and around the jungles was no longer just about the Black Pea Stones and 18th Street. It had become a broader struggle for influence, alliances, and survival in South Los Angeles. One of the most significant developments came with the involvement of the Rollin' 20s Bloods. Their entry into the conflict signaled a dangerous escalation. No longer was this a contained rivalry between two gangs contesting a single neighborhood. It was now a multi-set confrontation, with old alliances activated and new enemies identified. Each additional faction increased the scale of retaliation and the potential for mass casualties. For the Black Pea Stones, outside support reinforced their resolve. The jungles were still home ground, and losing them would mean more than losing territory. It would mean losing face across the city. The presence of allied blood sets strengthened defensive lines and emboldened retaliation. Shooters now operated with the knowledge that backup existed beyond the immediate neighborhood. That knowledge made restraint even less likely. For 18th Street, expansion was already part of their identity. They responded to resistance not by retreating, but by widening their reach. Additional cliques provided manpower and weapons. Retaliatory strikes became more coordinated, more aggressive, and less predictable. Violence spilled into nearby areas as members hunted rivals wherever they could be found. At convenience stores, house parties, and intersections far removed from the original spark on Gibraltar Avenue. This expansion made the conflict deadlier and more chaotic. Lines blurred. Mistaken identity became common. Individuals were slayed simply for resembling a rival or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Innocent residents were caught in the crossfire with increasing frequency. Each mistaken homicide deepened resentment and fueled new rumors of deliberate targeting, even when none existed. The jungles themselves became increasingly fortified. Lookouts were posted. Entry points were watched. Strangers were questioned or chased away. The neighborhood functioned like an occupied zone with shifting allegiances and constant surveillance. Residents learned which paths were safest at certain times of day and which stairwells to avoid altogether. Everyday life adapted around violence, normalizing it in ways that left deep psychological scars. Law enforcement could no longer ignore what was happening. The sheer volume of shootings forced the LAPD to acknowledge that Baldwin Village was experiencing something beyond routine gang activity. The area was officially designated a hotspot, a label that brought increased attention, but also underscored how far conditions had deteriorated. Specialized units were deployed and patrols intensified, but the results were mixed. Police presence disrupted some activity, but it also displaced violence. When pressure increased in the jungles, shootings occurred elsewhere. When patrols pulled back, the guns returned. The war adapted faster than enforcement strategies, exploiting every gap and delay. Arrests were made, but leadership structures remained largely intact. The cycle continued. By the late 1990s, fatigue began to set in. Members on all sides had lost friends, brothers, and mentors. Prison sentences mounted. Funerals became routine. Yet even exhaustion failed to end the conflict. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many grudges remained unresolved. Backing down was seen as dishonor, and dishonor invited further attack. The alliances that had intensified the war now made it harder to stop. Any pause risked being interpreted as weakness, not just by direct rivals, but by every allied set watching from the sidelines. The violence had taken on a momentum of its own, driven as much by fear of future retaliation as by anger over past homicides. As the decade wore on, the jungle stood battered but unbroken, its buildings scarred by bullets, its residents hardened by years of terror. The war had expanded beyond its original boundaries, reshaping gang dynamics across South Los Angeles. And while the worst of the open warfare would eventually slow, the damage had already been done. The final chapter of the conflict would not be written by the gangs alone, but by a different kind of force. One armed not with street reputation, but with indictments, surveillance, and federal power. By the time the new millennium arrived, the war in the jungles had burned itself to the institutional memory of Los Angeles. The open, daily gun battles that once defined Baldwin Village began to slow, not because the hatred had faded, but because the weight of sustained violence finally triggered a response, powerful enough to disrupt it. The battlefield was no longer ruled solely by street retaliation. It was now under scrutiny from forces far larger and far more methodical. The LAPD's designation of the jungles as a permanent hotspot marked a turning point. Specialized units, including the Safer City Unit, were deployed with a singular mission: suppress violence through constant presence. Patrols became relentless. Officers flooded courtyards, stairwells, and parking structures. Helicopters hovered nightly. Traffic stops multiplied. Probation and parole searches became routine. The jungles were no longer a blind spot. They were under siege from law enforcement. This pressure didn't end hostility, but it changed its expression. Open gun battles became riskier. Slayings grew more calculated, less frequent, but no less brutal. Violence retreated into shadows, occurring away from heavy patrols or outside the neighborhood altogether. The war had not ended. It had adapted. At the same time, federal authorities began building cases that reached beyond street-level shooters. Investigators tracked financial flows, wiretapped communications, and mapped relationships that connected local sets to broader criminal networks. The narcotics trade that once fueled the conflict now became its Achilles heel. Drugs left paper trails, money created leverage, and leverage led to indictments. Operations like Operation Stone Cold in 2005 struck at the heart of the Black Pea Stones infrastructure. Arrests swept up members who had long evaded consequences, including individuals tied to years-old homicides. Federal charges carried sentences far harsher than state cases, removing key figures from the streets permanently. The message was unmistakable. The era of unchecked dominance in the jungles was over. Years later, Operation Red Dawn in 2011 reinforced that message. By then, the conflict had lost much of its visible intensity, but its legacy remained deeply embedded. These federal actions didn't just target individuals. They dismantled networks, fractured command structures, and disrupted the continuity that had allowed violence to persist across generations. For residents, the change was gradual and uneasy. Gunfire became less frequent, but fear lingered. Parents still warned children. Older tenants still avoided certain pathways. Bullet scars remained etched into walls, silent reminders of years when survival felt uncertain. Trust between neighbors, between communities, between civilians and police was slow to rebuild. The racial wounds inflicted during the conflict proved especially stubborn. The war between a predominantly Latino gang and a black gang had amplified existing divisions, leaving behind a resentment that outlived the gunfire. Even as overt violence declined, the memory of who had been slaughtered, and by whom, continued to shape perceptions and alliances. For the gangs themselves, the jungle's conflict became legend and cautionary tale. It demonstrated the cost of unchecked expansion and absolute defense. It showed how drug profits could ignite wars that consumed entire neighborhoods. And it revealed the limits of street power when confronted by sustained law enforcement and federal scrutiny. Today, Baldwin Village still carries the name the Jungles, but it no longer resembles the battlefield it once was. The violence that defined the mid-1990s has receded, replaced by uneasy stability. Yet beneath that surface lies history written in blood, hundreds of shootings, countless lives altered, and a community forever marked by a war it never asked for. The conflict between 18th Street and the Black Pea Stones did not simply erupt and vanish. It reshaped South Los Angeles, hardened policing strategies, and redefined how gang wars were understood in an era of racial tension and narcotics-driven power. It stands as a grim reminder of how quickly a neighborhood can be transformed when territory, identity, and profit collide, and how long the echoes of that violence continue to be heard, long after the last shot is fired.